Hi guys, it's Ben here from T-Rex Space Station. How's everyone doing? Now, the 8-bit and 16-bit era featured some incredibly difficult video games. People really didn't mess around with the difficulty curves of games back then, and I guess a large part of the reason for that was because, well, carts were only a certain size and you could only fit a small amount of data on them, so the developers wanted to prolong the experience and, make sure you couldn't just beat it in a single day or something. The Mega Drive in particular has got some very hard games, not necessarily bad games, but just ones that I've played and thought, how am I ever going to complete this? And so today I've chosen a selection of difficult Mega Drive games to talk about. My choices are by no means completely exhaustive, and have got a few more games in my collection that I'd like to talk about at a later time, but let's take a look at these 5 to start with. The first game I've chosen is Alien 3. Now, I'm a big fan of the Alien movies, in particular Alien 1 and Alien 2. I don't know about you guys, but the third movie is one of my least favourites. For some reason it just didn't kind of gel with me that much. That's the one that's set on the space prison and you've got the mutant alien dog that's running around, and it seemed to deviate from the classical Alien formula somewhat. I'm pleased to say that the video game actually doesn't closely resemble the third Alien movie that much. The alien dog is nowhere to be seen, and actually this just features your bog standard xenomorph kind of enemies, which is cool. Now, the basic premise for the game is actually really good. You play as Ripley, running around these space stations, and you've got to rescue humans who've been incarcerated by the aliens. It's a pretty difficult side-scrolling run-and-gun type game where you've got to go up ladders and drop down and jump over platforms and avoid falling into fans and all that kind of good stuff. The difficulty comes from the fact that the xenomorphs are pretty damn overpowered. They appear with very little notice and basically jump on you with incredible speed. You do have a very good arsenal of weapons here: shotgun, machine gun, flamethrower, grenades, but most of them fire agonizingly slowly, and you've got really just a few seconds to react to the xenomorphs before you'll get pummeled and crushed. And that's where the difficulty comes in. You seem to be so slow compared to the aliens, who are incredibly quick. Now, the good part of that is that I do like the fact that you feel vulnerable. I always found it really weird in Alien games where the xenomorphs feel weak and you feel completely overpowered, because, say for example in the first Alien movie, you're only up against one xenomorph who could kill you instantly. That was one of the things that I liked about Alien Isolation. The power balance was put back and the xenomorph was king and would really rip you to shreds if you messed up. However, I feel like the difficulty in this game has gone a little bit too far the other way. If this game was just a run and gun shooter, you may be able to get used to it, but for some reason they decided to add a time limit to each of the levels, which is what makes it so bloody difficult. There's no map, there's no recording of where you've been, so when you die you have to try to remember the locations of the prisoners, and the timing is incredibly tight. You get something like 3 or 4 minutes to go through pretty big sprawling levels with lots of false corridors and wrong ways to go. And it just becomes incredibly stressful trying to battle your way through xenomorph armies and not run out of time. And the trick to the game basically is to play the levels over and over and over again until you've completely memorized the fastest path through the level. It's a game that has so many things to love about it. The fact that the graphics are really good, the xenomorphs are powerful, you have a good arsenal of weapons, the level design is great. But I can't say that I love it completely because of the fact that the time limit is just so punishing and the difficulty level is just too high. It is recommended if you're a sucker for difficult games, but man, you've got to have nerves of steel. Next up is Chakan, the Forever Man. Now this, I'll start by saying, this is a really, really cool game, a cool concept for a game, and I love the protagonist. I don't know if you guys have heard of this game before, but I came across it from watching YouTube videos. Now, you play as this really badass looking skeletal guy called Chakan, who seems to be wandering around in this weird supernatural spiritual plane, and you go between these different worlds, and basically it's kind of like a hack and slash platformer. It's got some pretty interesting systems in there. There's a system where you can mix potions to make spells and give yourself superpowers, and the worlds are incredibly detailed and really good looking graphically. The game has such a badass fantasy sci-fi kind of spacey feeling to it, and I think the aesthetic, the art style, and the character design in Chakan are superb, and I love seeing the game for those reasons. The game falls down though on the hair-tearing difficulty of the gameplay, and this isn't necessarily just because the game is difficult, but it's also a combination of difficult and cheap and glitchy. so that often you'll just feel like the game is stacked against you and you're never going to get through it. You actually do have a reasonable range of attacks. You've got these two big swords, you can attack in multiple directions, and you can do these big double jumps. But even small enemies like fish or flies seem to be able to circumnavigate your weapons and continually attack you and damage you, and you're constantly just getting sapped of your energy and pushed back. The levels become just so frustrating and so hard to get through that without serious determination, some YouTube videos, a walkthrough, and a hell of a lot of patience, you're not going to get anywhere in this game. I have managed to beat one or two of the worlds by learning of ways to exploit the bosses and kind of, you know, similar to some other games like Double Dragon or Altered Beast, where there are certain techniques and tricks to get through them more easily. There are ways here to find vulnerabilities in the bosses and basically spam or cheat the game in some ways. Without that though, I just find it so bloody difficult. It's a game that I want to like because of how beautiful it is, because of how cool Chakan is, because of the badassness. But really, this game comes with a health warning. I hope you don't have high blood pressure, because if you play this game, it's going to tip you over the edge. Next up is an absolute classic, and that is Ghouls and Ghosts on the Sega Mega Drive. This is such a fantastic, such a legendary, such a well-known game that I can't do anything but love it. I obviously love it, it's so well designed, the gameplay is brilliant, but of course, it's notoriously bloody difficult. If you haven't played the game before, the port on the Sega Mega Drive is really good looking graphically. I know this game's been on multiple different systems, and I don't really have any experience of the other systems, but what I can say is this version looks very nice. It's a classic kind of platformer, sort of hack and slash. You've got to attack enemies with various weapons, throwing out spears. And the thing that makes these games so classic is the basic 2 hits and you're dead thing. You take 1 hit, you lose your armor, then run around like a naked guy. Take 1 more hit, and you're dead. And the enemies in this game are relentless. They seem to spawn indefinitely, continuously. On some of the levels there are sort of bouncing whirlwinds and bouncing turtle shells and bridges with bits that fall away. And you'll really have to have a lot of patience to get through the levels because of how much memorization there is involved. I myself play it on practice mode where you get infinite runs, and even with infinite runs I still find that I can barely get past the 2nd level onto the 3rd stage. The boss fights are really good. Again, they need a lot of practice. You can very easily find yourself coming unstuck. If you stand in the wrong place, you take a fireball, you know, 1 hit and then suddenly you're feeling very vulnerable. It's hard not to like the game. It doesn't make any pretenses. Everybody who knows and likes this game is fully aware of the fact that it's gonna be a very difficult ride. But when I do play it, I really enjoy myself for maybe half an hour to 40 minutes. There's a balance with this one, a kind of sweet spot where you've had enough time away from it so that you can enjoy it, but you've not tried and tried and tried so much that you're starting to get too frustrated. It's a highly recommended game. I love the artwork on the box, I love the graphics, and I love the gameplay, and I think most collections would benefit from having it in there. But again, it doesn't take any prisoners. It's a game that really is going to kick you in the crotch if you faff around too much. But I have to recommend that game because it's Ghouls and Ghosts. Next up, we have a superb shmup. You knew there were going to be shmups in here, there always have to be. And this is Hellfire. This is an incredibly good game, a game with really good music that I have covered before, shameless self-plugging there, and it's a very, very solid, tight, side-scrolling shooter. Now the interesting thing about this game is that there are actually not really any new firing modes that you get. You do get power-ups, I think, that increases the strength of your shot, but the firing modes you start with are the ones that you finish with. And it has an interesting mechanic that you have basically 4 firing modes that you can alternate between by pressing a button. One that fires before you, one that fires behind you, a kind of cross-shot thing, and one that fires up and down the screen. And that's really interesting because you need to adapt your shot patterns to kind of adapt to where the enemies are coming from on the screen. And certain shot patterns will suit certain waves of enemies, certain parts of the levels, certain approaches to the game. And that's kind of part of the sort of way you master it. You do get a lot of help in that you get one of those little droids that floats around with you and will take bullets for you and actually attack the bosses, and that's cool. But it's one of those games, one of those notorious shmup games where if you die, you start again with no power-ups. So if you die once, you're by definition going to die again, because say on the later stages, if you make a slip-up, you're then trying to get through gauntlets of enemies and really difficult bullet patterns, with basically minimal damage and very few power-ups. The thing that I found most difficult with this game is the tight corridors to navigate. There's lots of moving blocks and things and very difficult maneuvering that you've got to do, but also the boss fights, which get really difficult around stage 3 and 4. There's one with these kind of circles that move in a strange conformation, they go diagonally, then they change, and I just can't seem to figure out the pattern in my head. I've played that boss, I think it's end of stage 3 or 4, so many times, and I still can't get it. I'm like, okay, so now I need to move, oh fuck, I died again. Now I need to move, oh, I did it again. There's something about it that I can't figure out. I think I need to play it on an emulator so I can actually slow it down, practice it, save state it, and try and get my head around the weird boss patterns. It's a really good game. I have to recommend it if you're a shmup fan, because it's one of the great shmups on the system. Great soundtrack, great gameplay. But man, again, it's really, really hard. Nevertheless, I don't find this one too frustrating because it's so fun to play, and I know it's one that just needs a lot of practice. If I had many more hours in the day, I think that I will be able to get past that boss at some point, but who knows. Anyway, definitely one to check out if you like shmups. And then, last but not least, a game that's not often spoken of, it's the Immortal on the Sega Mega Drive. Now, I once described this as basically being a 16-bit Dark Souls, which, yeah, it's not that accurate, but you can kind of see what I mean if you know this game. There aren't that many RPGs on the Mega Drive. They're quite a rare breed, and that's why I kind of like picking them up now and then. And this is quite a unique role-playing game on the system. It's an isometric dungeon crawler. You play as a wizard, investigating the disappearance of some other wizard in the dungeon. It's very kind of old Dungeons and Dragons fare with goblins and wizards and skeletons and spells and traps and all that kind of stuff. It's got an inventory system, and it's got an interesting combat system where you go close to the enemy and you go into a separate screen, and you have this kind of face-to-face combat where you're twatting each other with sticks and swords and whatever else. The cool thing is, though, when you kill the enemies, you get this lovely gory animation with a load of blood splattering everywhere, and they just kind of explode into giblets. Ever since the Quake days, I've always been a big fan of people exploding into giblets. I don't know why, it's just that ID Software nerd in me that has always loved that since I was a kid playing Doom and Wolfenstein and whatever else, and Quake, yeah. The thing with this game, though, is that it doesn't really hold your hand. You don't really know where you're going. You can very easily die from the combat. And the levels are kind of full of traps where it's like, oh, I stood on the wrong tile, now I instantly disappear and die. Oh, I stood on a trap, now an arrow's got me. Basically have to be really thick-skinned and prepared to face the levels time and time again, and just respond to the fact that you may randomly die in kind of like a roguelike way. It is kind of comical at first when you see yourself slipping down a hole to your death, but then once you've tried to actually get through the level for the 10th time, you're kind of like, this is getting a little bit old now, I think I'm going to go play some Sonic the Hedgehog. It is a good game, it's got great graphics, it looks very much like old isometric PC role-playing games. I love the fantasy feel, I love the graphics and the combat, the spell system, inventory items, all that good stuff is in there. It's just a little bit too cheap, a little bit too harsh, and too punishing. I'm not a big fan of Dark Souls actually, so maybe that's why I kind of think it's that level of difficulty. It's just kind of like do it over and over again until you finally scream. But it is an interesting game, so it's one worth checking out because it's pretty unspoken about, really. Maybe a hidden gem, you might call it, I don't know. But there you have it, there's 5 difficult Mega Drive games. I'd like to hear your suggestions for difficult Mega Drive games, and let me know if you agree with my choices. If you guys like this video, I may do another one with some more choices from my collection, and as always, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye!